to the American Indian Alaska Native Behavioral Health webinar series. My name is Jenny Richards, and today we want to welcome Nazba to speak on the impact of colonization in Native communities. The training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native ATPC. We are one of 4 national focus centers serving the ATPC network, which also includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. To learn more about the ATPC network, please visit our center is a NADAC-approved certified provider, and we'll be happy to provide you with continuing education for a $15 fee. The request form is available for download in the Files pod, which is in the lower left-hand corner of the webinar screen, and will also be sent in a follow-up email to all who attended. Immediately following today's webinar, you will be redirected to our different evaluation. This survey asks about your satisfaction with the event and will take less than 10 minutes to complete. We thank you in advance for helping us to improve our programming. Sorry. Okay, you will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please use the Q&A pod to share your questions and comments, and we'll address questions at appropriate points during the presentation. If you prefer, you may view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking on the full screen button at the top right corner of the presentation pod, which looks like 4 arrows pointing outward. To return to the regular view, click on the button again. We'd also like you to be aware that this webinar records participant attention time. If you minimize the webinar or are working on another window, the system will record your participation as inactive, which may be reflected in the number of CEUs received. The opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official position of CSAT and SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's speaker is Nazba Khan. Please join me in welcoming Nazba, and I will pass things over to you for now. So let's switch over to Nazba. Oh. Okay.
And Lena and the whole team for getting me up and running here. I'm hoping that my audio is okay for everyone. Of course, if it isn't, definitely send a message through our Q&A or to Kate if there's any issues with the audio. Okay, so before I begin, I just wanted to introduce myself real quickly, to say a quick hello. Yat'e. I am Navajo from the Southwest in the United States, although I'm living in Toronto, Canada now. And as per our traditional practices, letting you know my clans. So I am the Salt Clan, Ashiha, born for the Folded Arms people, Bit'ahni. My maternal clan is the Reed people, or Luk'atna, and my paternal clan is the Bitterwater people, Twitich Eatney. So that is how I have been taught to introduce myself, and to let others know who I am, and to, make relations based on that. So welcome, and I really appreciate everyone for making it on the call, and also really for your patience. This is a new process for everyone, including myself, so thank you. And also, before we begin again, I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of this work has been called together through personal experience as a provider, working with Native communities in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area. And inside of that, some amazing colleagues who've helped me develop my thinking and work around this issue. So my colleague Michelle Moss and I actually presented a different version of what I'm presenting today to people within the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, and I've adapted it here for information on Two-Spirit community. Want to acknowledge my work at the Native American Health Center, also in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area. I learned a lot working there, and I'm really grateful for my time and experience there. Also did a lot of work with Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits in the San Francisco area. Just an amazing organization. They're hosting the only Two-Spirit powwow in the nation that we know of, that is organized by Two-Spirit community members in conjunction with allies. So it's a beautiful event that happens every year. And then also for the work that I did with Friendship House, which is a sister organization to Native American Health Center. I learned a lot as an intern there, working with the groups and the residents there, as well as the staff members, and they've been great allies and really the work that we've done around Two-Spirit community there as well. So I just wanted to put that out there. So this webinar is really focusing on reclaiming voice, body, spirit, the impact of colonization on our Two-Spirit community members. How do I go to the next?
Naswa, in the bottom left-hand corner, there are those little arrows.
Oh, right.
Of your slide.
Yes, I got it. Yeah, thank you so much, Lita. I just saw that. So this presentation in general will give an overview of the impact of historical and current trauma on the American Indian Alaska Native community, as well as offering a clinical analysis of historical trauma symptoms and really presentation of clients coming in that I've worked with at the health center and also Friendship House. And then some really amazing things that we've seen in terms of cultural and clinical strategies that we've done with the community there, both at the health center and then outside of the health center, as well with community groups and other organizations, really getting a good look at what that community, San Francisco Bay Area community, is doing with respect to rebuilding the Two-Spirit community and welcoming them back into the circle. And I believe a lot of the people on the call today are familiar with Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart's work and her definition of historical trauma. And she writes, historical trauma is cumulative, emotional, and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. I first came across this thinking when I actually entered the health center back in 2006 as an intern. And it was profound. One, because a Native woman had actually written it and was doing work inside of it, which is great mirroring for me as another Native person in the work. But also for someone to really speak to what has happened and what is currently still happening in terms of historical processes and then current time processes that our communities are negotiating, whether on reservations or in urban areas. So the next few slides really will actually take apart this definition or this statement to really point out what that looks like in more detail from our perspective. I also did some work with a program called CUAV, Community United Against Violence. They respond to LGBT and the impact of hate violence on that community, as well as generative somatics when I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I came across a really great way that they were positioning oppression and its impact on all of us, really. And was able to reframe it so that we can see the impact on Native communities. And they actually put forth systems of oppression, 4 of them, that are working in an interconnected way to really have a detrimental impact on our Native communities. And so those systems are economic supremacy, white supremacy, male supremacy, and Christian supremacy. And some of these, are not anything new. It's just the ways that we frame these systems. For me, it was really helpful in seeing how they work together and how they impact our communities. And so we'll begin first, actually, with talking a little bit about Christian supremacy. Inside of this, it's really important to delineate the spiritual connection that each person has to religious practice versus the institution. I find that given the large presence of Christianity inside of Native communities and the sort of impact that a statement like Christian supremacy might have, it's just important to make those delineations, given that there are people who have a relationship with Christian faith that is very helpful for them and has been a big part of their lives, and versus the institutions inside of Christianity, basically, and the impact those institutions have had on our Native communities. So I've just been asked to increase my mic. So hopefully that works well. And so inside of Christian supremacy, there has been a lot of writing and research about really this idea, or what we know as missions or Christian institutions, missionaries, going into communities and really shaping very forcefully the way that community members are seeing themselves in the community. And so we, know a lot about the boarding school systems and the detrimental impact that had on everyone, and including Two-Spirit community members, especially with the pushing of gender roles within those institutions, forcing people to adjust how they were presenting in their gender presentation, cutting their hair, forcing them to wear either, a male or female dress, even if they weren't comfortable with that. And then, of course, the abuse that we all know that has been documented inside of those institutions. And then moving on over into economic supremacy, I wanted to point out, and I went to the census.gov to really get some updated information about income and poverty within Native communities, and came up with some numbers here. So $35,062 versus $50,046. So the median income of American Indian and Alaska Native households is $35,000 in comparison with the $50,000 for the nation as a whole. And I think given the impact of disenfranchisement from a lot of the ways that we were connected to land, resources on those land, ability to make a living and a life and to support our families based on that, and then the subsequent reservation systems, the sort of special relationship that our community members have with the U.S. government, and how that really doesn't allow for development on a lot of our communities, and how difficult that can be. It's not surprising that the income of a lot of our community members is far below the average for the nation. And then in terms of the 28.4% versus 15.3%, 28.4% of our community members are in poverty, and this was in 2010 that I'm getting these numbers from. for the nation. And so the nation as a whole, 15.3% of overall U.S. nation people are in poverty. And again, I think this points to systematic and long processes of disenfranchising Native community members from seeking education, employment, either on reservation or off reservation, and really sets us up to see that the numbers that we're seeing now. And then moving on over to white supremacy. So this idea that whiteness, which is an idea that was created, and that whiteness in and of itself is seen as superior to other races, which is also something else that was made up. But in terms of Two-Spirit community members, we look a lot at we look towards some research that has happened within the community, where we're noticing in self-reported surveys that there was trends of people who are perpetrating against Native women were not Native, mostly white. And there was another interesting research through Karina Walters and University of Washington, and the sort of correlations that they were drawing between condom use between natives and between natives and non-natives. So they were seeing that there was a higher rate of condom use between natives, and that rate decreased when a non-native, especially white person, entered the picture. And so a lot of inferences around there around power and how Native community members relate to that, especially as it relates to their health. And then in terms of Two-Spirit community as well, there are bigger national conversations that are happening in the mainstream around what it means to be LGBT. And then there's language that gets developed around that. And one of the pieces around that is coming out, which there has been a lot of writing now from community members and scholars around how that term doesn't really apply to our community, that it has, has a very different implication and a different process. And so, terms that Two-Spirit community members are beginning to use or identify with really center around becoming. So really moving into this awareness of yourself as Two-Spirit, or coming in. So coming into this new understanding of yourself, or long-held understanding of yourself, and really blending in with that, and not really making a big spectacle of it, if you will. And so really the language that mainstream community uses, which is often white mainstream, doesn't readily align with Two-Spirit community members and their processes around identity, and how they're seeing themselves in the broader community. And I think even the term of the Two-Spirit was also brought up to really delineate from the LGBT mainstream conversation about Two-Spirit identity. And that happened in the 90s in the International Two-Spirit Society. And so there's this way that the term Two-Spirit is used as a political marker, as a political identity, to really let people know we're here, and there are a lot of intersecting things that people have to consider in addition to just being queer for Two-Spirit community members. And then finally, male supremacy, the idea that masculinity, maleness is superior to femininity and female identities. And how we see that being sort of practiced or exercised, sort of the negative impact of that has been, the binary gender roles, the male-female, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, and then again moving back towards boarding school era, and also just the institution of the U.S. as a whole, the settlers and government officials insisting on only dealing with men and appointing men as leaders, as head of household, and really negating and minimizing the impact of the and importance of the role of women and Two-Spirit community members who historically would have been negotiators and leaders in their community. So really displacing a big part of the community from positions of leadership and power. And then other ways that we see the impact of male supremacy is just the rates of assault and abuse, mostly on women and Two-Spirit community, but also on men as well. There's been some great work happening around destigmatizing the impact of assaults on men, and that it's a reality. So more men are stepping forward and reporting that and talking about their experiences. And even that is really fighting back against homophobia, against our ideas about what masculinity and maleness is. So there's been some great work happening around that. And so to wrap up this slide here, a really good example of how they all intersect and work is if we think about the boarding school system, we see that there were men primarily in charge of that, white men usually, who were being reimbursed by the government to run these systems, to really carve out and take away children from communities, thereby impacting so many different elements of a community, and a really good way to break up a community.
Your microphone has been turned on.
So moving on to the next slide, and breaking down Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart's statement. We're talking about massive group trauma experiences. And so in the center there, you can see the tribe and person and all the different ways that they've been impacted. So from the Indian wars, war traumas, policies that were enacted, smallpox blankets, all the sort of infections they came into contact with boarding schools. And then more recently, we're noticing health issues, issues around suicide, cancers, homicides, domestic violence, sexual violence, and so on. So I just wanted to give a visual for how we're seeing the massive group trauma experiences. So inside of a community experiencing such intense trauma from historical to current processes, I think it's really important to reframe how we see trauma. So definitely trauma, depending on the nature of it, there's a lot of different things that there's a spectrum of it, everything from what I just described all the way into like medical traumas, car accidents, those sorts of things. But in general, as human beings, we have inside of us, without thinking about it, trauma responses that we have. And a lot of these you might have heard about, and there's probably a new one that you might not have heard about so much. But the three that we often hear about is fight, flight, and freeze. So whenever there's a trauma, people either fight, run away from it, or freeze. The more newer one that I've heard of is appease. So this idea that you go along with the trauma to lessen it. And in either household or community situations where there's ongoing violence and trauma, and the victim or victims know that it's imminent and that it's going to happen anyway, there is a sense of going with it to lessen the impact of it. And this is a pretty smart strategy, given options that person or that community might have in terms of ways to sustain and preserve their bodies or their communities. And of course, inside of all of these responses, people dissociate. So you really don't want to be present in your body for any of these. And so there's different ways that people, dissociate and are not feeling their bodies when these things are happening. And in the work that I've done and learned with inside of generative somatics, one of the teachers, Stacey Haynes, puts forth that these trauma responses are actually intelligent responses, and that they've helped us to get through trauma. And that when we see people coming in for services, we see that those responses are actually not useful in the present time. It becomes a fixed response to everyday situations that are not traumatic but perceived as traumatic. So people usually come in and are, telling us maybe there's an impact on their relationships, view of themselves, maybe impact at work, those sorts of things. And so people then come on in and they want to figure out ways to work on those situations. But the reason that I highlight intelligent responses is oftentimes people in communities are blamed for their responses to traumatic situations. There's a sense of like, what is wrong with you? Did you not know any better? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you hadn't been wearing those things, or why do you have to be so, flagrantly queer, for example, or those sorts of things, right? So it's like people aren't the issue and communities aren't the issue. It's, for example, homophobia is the issue, poverty is the issue, someone's previous experiences of trauma might be coloring a situation, those sorts of things. So racism, all of that. So all of those are bigger issues that often don't get held accountable, and it's usually individuals and communities that get blamed for their response to situations. And so with the trauma responses, if there is ongoing trauma happening, we definitely see people coming in with a lot of anxiety, low self-esteem, anger issues. They often talk about, I have depression or these issues, but there's no reason for me to be depressed, or no reason for these things to be happening. I don't know what's happening. And so those are times when we, really do a thorough assessment and then learn that maybe a grandparent was in boarding school, or learn about, what their experiences were on or off the reservation, maybe experiences of racism, those sorts of things. And then really get a sense of the ways that they're presenting with their shame, experiences of homophobia, those sorts of things. We see how they are really doing their best to adapt and negotiate the world that they're living inside of. And so we see that, prior to colonization and the systematic process of that, and very forceful process, there was generally a sense of communities being fairly whole, right? And really attuning to the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health of their community members. And after, lots of traumatic experiences through the process of colonization, we see that there is fragmentation, that there's emotional and psychological wounding. And for good reasons, people are responding to colonization with fragmentation. So we see dissociative processes, emotional masking, somatic numbing, and on some level what my previous colleague Michelle Moss referred to as spiritual death, little or lack of connection to spiritual practices, a sense of spiritual self, really seeing themselves as a sacred and spiritual person, and really little of that. And so when Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart talks about how it's over the lifespan and across generations, we then begin to see the impact of colonization on the community, right? So we see the complexity of multifaceted health disparities, and there are so many. There's been so much research around the health of our communities, and how we see rates of diabetes, of maybe cancer, of depression, heart disease, those sorts of things, substance use. And then we also look at how community members are dealing with the trauma that's happening in their communities. And we oftentimes hear an overload of reports of people who are coping, using substances, hurting themselves or other people, those sorts of things. And also, people coming in and really not knowing who they are or what their purpose in life is, what their sort of life direction is, and not really sure if it's safe to align with certain roles because they see that it's not safe to be out, for example, in their communities. And then there's also just the ways that our communities have really been impacted, right? So I actually want to read to you an amazing quote by a writer, Leanne Simpson, who is a native from Canada up here. And she very succinctly writes about how, and I quote, "Land is not mentioned in any of the recommendations, in part because the commission was set up to focus on individual suffering in residential schools. Yet, residential schools were a strategy used by Canada to break the connection between Indigenous peoples and our lands, so the state could access the land for settlement and for natural resources. By taking our children and holding them hostage, the federal government truncated what Indigenous parents were willing to do to resist the most devastating aspects of colonialism. By breaking the intimate connection between children and their families, their culture, their language, and their land, the state was attempting to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian society and eliminate barriers to natural resources and land. By removing children from Indigenous education systems, the state was hoping to eliminate Indigenous forms of governance and leadership." And inside of that quote, I feel like Leanne Simpson really captures how people's connection to land and the severance of that really was a disconnection from being able to provide for yourself and for your family, and also just set up a system where capitalism, and when we talked about economic supremacy in one of the first slides, one of the ways that we see economic supremacy playing out is this idea of predatory capitalism, that you go into communities and disenfranchise people who are connected to the land, so that you can extract resources and maybe even people as a resource for the benefit of very few, while the land and people are exploited and really left to deal with the impact, the devastating impact of that process. And so then we see capitalism really being internalized and embodied inside of how we see each other and the land and resources. So there's this idea that there's little to go around for everyone. And so then if there's a few things to go around, who can we, kick out of our community so that we have more of whatever this thing is. And so you see things like disenrollment happening. You see communities really aligning with mining companies, those sorts of things, to extract resources from the land in a way that doesn't really benefit the land or the community, especially the community's health and also the land's health. And so there's a huge impact on the community. And again, those systems of oppression are continuing to operate very smoothly, even up to this day. And I feel like there is definitely movements happening, and have always been happening, but more so now, with a pushback against a lot of colonization. And so again, carrying on the statement by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart of intergenerational trauma happening over the lifespan and across generations. So this slide really it shows actually what that process would look like. So really that starting from the upper left with experience there, that a community has an experience of some trauma, let's say homophobia, for example, and that there's an adaptive coping response. So perhaps people are not out or don't really let people know that they are LGBT or Two-Spirit. That gets normalized in the family. You don't talk about it, and then used inside of relationships. So perhaps instead of being out and proud about who you are, or being recognized for who you are, instead you choose to maybe engage in a more heteronormative context. And that gets carried into adulthood, so really repressing Two-Spirit identity. That gets normalized in your family, then you teach that to your children, they're exposed to it, and that process continues. And this slide really is a great visual that my previous colleague, Michelle Moss, shared with me, and I just thought it was a great way to sort of visualize what that process might look like, in all the ways that we learn about oppression and how we pass that on with each other. And so this next slide shows then what people who are coming in for services, all the things that they're coming in with, right? So in the center of the slide, we see the tribe and people and the impact of historical trauma on their bodies and current trauma on their communities, the responses to that, so the anxiety, the shame, substance use, all of that, and then the outer circle, how all of that is passed down, like I just mentioned in the previous slide. And then really how that gets fragmented into the different parts of themselves. So their mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual processes. And so oftentimes this is who is coming in for services at a place like the Native American Health Center, Friendship House, and just out in the community. And so, given the tremendous weight of colonization on our communities and Two-Spirit communities in general, specifically for this presentation, a lot of the work that we've done in the San Francisco Bay Area has really moved from how do we help people individually all the way into how can we support our community, because they're doing a lot of work in connection to and outside of the work that the Health Center and Friendship House is doing. And of course, individually, you're definitely rebuilding safety for people, teaching them those skills, teaching them coping skills, teaching them resiliency strategies, and making sure that your agency is trauma informed, with a safe facility and a trained staff. And there has been a lot of work around like how do we make our agency and train our staff to be trauma informed, so that a client coming in and the way that they're behaving is not taken personally, but it's really they're showing us all the things that they're struggling with and dealing with, and they're really asking for help. And the fact that they made it to our site is a huge step for a lot of people, given that oftentimes community members don't trust institutions. So really working on naming and acknowledging what they're struggling with, validating their feelings around their responses towards a lot of the oppressive ways that they're experiencing the world. And this idea that if we're working with people to heal individually, that has an impact on community health. And the work that I'm doing now, there's this thing called a safety shape. And the safety shape really is the responses and fixed responses that a person has, that they have developed to really preserve themselves. And it tends to really move towards one of the trauma responses. So someone might be a fighter, someone might, move away from things, or someone might freeze, or might be an appeaser. And the sort of reframing of that safety shape is really coming from a strengths-based perspective, that there are skills that trauma gives us, and then there are skills that we don't get because of trauma. And people coming into our site, we know that they are so skilled at negotiating a pretty oppressive world. So we like to really see those skills as a safety shape. It really helped them to get there. And so then a lot of the work that I've done with people, and I'm doing with people currently, is how do I integrate the healing on a more holistic level, including their mind, body, and spirit. And then working on empowering people around a lot of different areas. Some other amazing things that we've seen happen in the community. So if we think about individuals having a shape, right, having a way of being and operating, and also a community having a way of being and operating in their shape. We see that there has been a lot of work around spirituality, ritual, and ceremony, and that's a lot of things are being innovated. So a couple of years ago, the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland hosted a becoming ceremony for TwoSpirit community members. So it was put on by TwoSpirit community leaders with the support of a straight ally who was an elder. And it was a beautiful ceremony. TwoSpirit and allies showed up, talked about, again, the impact of colonization on Native communities, and really the detrimental impact of that, including homophobia, transphobia, all the ways that TwoSpirit community have been excluded generally. And so they actually did a very explicit welcoming back into the circle for TwoSpirit community members, which is very touching, very beautiful. And so this is a practice that other communities can take up, and you can plan in conjunction with either your TwoSpirit organization that's nearby, or even TwoSpirit community members in your area, along with elders and allies who are TwoSpirit affirming, really supportive of LGBT TwoSpirit community members. You can definitely make it your own. There's also been a lot of work around engaging elders who are allies and really asking them about, what is our creation stories around TwoSpirit community members, and if there aren't any, what is that about? What does that mean? What might have been the cause of that? So there can be a great conversation with elders around reclaiming these stories. And then more recently, I've had a mother approach me, very happy about their kid coming out to them. And I suggested to her, I said, if there's a way that you can have a dinner, a little party or something, really acknowledging your child for being brave and coming out to you, to also mark that transition in their life, really as a coming of age ceremony or dinner or something, and in the ways that we do other ceremonies. I think, even families can begin that practice as well. So there's all these different ways that there's acknowledgement and celebration of TwoSpirit identity on an individual, family, and community level that we've seen happening, and it's just beautiful. And also in terms of reconnecting with the family and community, currently I know of that there's at least 16 Two-Spirit organizations across the nation, and there's probably more forming as we're talking. And they do a lot of amazing things. As I mentioned, the Bates Two-Spirit group hosts an annual powwow. I think it's like in its 5th year this year. And they do an honoring of Two-Spirit leaders as well as allies. So it's just a great way for the community to interact with Two-Spirit community in a space that's safe for Two-Spirit community. There's also an international Two-Spirit gathering that happens every year, and it moves all over from Canada to the U.S. And definitely, if you are curious about where the next one might be, I can point you to where they are if you know of, if you want to go yourself, or if you know people that you think should go to them, just for their connection to community. There's also the Phoenix P Flag group, run by an amazing ally who has a kid who is Two-Spirit, and they are doing some amazing work around supporting parents and friends of Two-Spirit community members, and are readily available to be a resource and a support. And again, there's just formed the International Council of Two-Spirit Societies, made up of 16 groups so far. People can be sponsored in to be part of that. And there are a big body of people who are working on, for example, how do we define Two-Spirit? How do we even spell it? Those sorts of things, all the way into what are issues impacting our community and how do we want to engage each other and the community to support us in working through those issues. And then in the sort of more specific nonprofit work that I've done, I really was amazed by, excuse me, the adaptability of the GONA, the Gathering of Native Americans. And I, was trained in that by, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her first name, Theta Newbreast. She came in, trained our staff, and we're able to host it for the general population. We adapted it to elders, to Two-Spirit community members, to men, to women, and to youth. And it is a great, I think, way to introduce community to the history of colonization, to really empower them to see their own strengths and their own power inside of community, that they have, that they can impact their community in a positive way. And also to really get a sense of community, a sense of, what can I do individually that will have an impact on my community. I also know that in the Bay Area, within the Two-Spirit groups there, that there's different generations working together. I remember an elder saying, if there are 4 generations within a room at any event, we know that we're in the healing time. And I've been seeing that more and more, especially given that a lot of our communities were not present because they might have been away to boarding school or away at work, or might not be a part of our communities anymore for other reasons too. The KQED also during the Native Heritage Month offers community local hero awards, and they have nominated and presented to Two-Spirit community members inside of that, so that not only do our Native community members see who our heroes are, but also the broader San Francisco Bay Area community as well. And then, like I mentioned before, Two-Spirit allies are honored at events. I think it's really important to make these connections and make these relationships where we engage allies to support us in working on resolving homophobia, transphobia, sorts of things, and really moving the conversation away from that there's something wrong with Two-Spirit community, and really more like there's something wrong with homophobia, right? Like that these concepts and systems really are the issue and not the people. And allies are really great at helping us mitigate that process. And then one final way that you can definitely use or see Two-Spirit, the term especially inside of other terms that are coming up. For example, the term queer, you can make that a verb and say queering. And so really, if a lot of us are inside of this process of a binary gender process, for example, and that we've internalized and embodied that, even Two-Spirit community members, you know, or other sort of scripts that were handed about this is how you're supposed to be as a person and all these things. And if we know that a lot of those scripts are based on the systems of oppression, which would mean that a lot of those scripts about how to be in this world would be oppressive to a community or a culture, we can definitely queer those scripts by saying it doesn't always have to be this way. What are ways that we can be that step outside of those boxes? So it could be that we see ourselves differently inside of that. We see our relationship to each other differently. Perhaps it allows for more latitude with, for example, men being able to be nurturers more, women being in other roles aside from what they've been given, and also that Two-Spirit community comes back into the community with roles of being valued and held and honored. So really seeing the value of LGBT Two-Spirit queer identity. So with all of this happening, we definitely see how we can flip that intergenerational trauma process on its head. And if we're introducing new skills, introducing different ways of being, introducing healing, all these things, all of those, again, can be an experience that's introduced into a person, a family, and a community. And it follows that same pattern of that experience of maybe instead of being homophobic, that there is inclusiveness of queer community, Two-Spirit community. The coping response to that is that people, value and respect Two-Spirit community. That's normalized in the family, used in relationships. That behavior is carried into adulthood for those kids. They normalize it in their family. The new generation is born. They teach it to their kids, and so on and so forth. And so in this way, I've seen and I know that this process is happening. And to give you a good example of it, a couple of years ago, we had a youth come out to her peer group in one of the youth programs at the health center. And her peers were very supportive. And she was able to be out about who she was. And she actually became a youth leader from that perspective, and was able to speak to other groups of people and really become this leader. And I remember one of the youth providers saying, 10 years ago, this would not have happened. We would have had staff members and community members and her peers who would not have been as open or been as supportive, and might even have told the young person to not be out about that. And so that was such a touching and inspiring thing to see. And now that young person who is, an adult now, is thriving. They're out and open with their family, their friends, all of us, and we're just so excited about their life. Like, they don't have to go through all the oppressive ways that a lot of us have been through around Two-Spirit identity, and they get to actually just live their life with support, and they're thriving. And that's really what we want for not only Two-Spirit community members, but also for other Native community members as well. And so when we attend to the different aspects of a person's spiritual, mental, physical, emotional self, we definitely see that people's sort of relationships to spirituality changes, right? There's a range of understanding. There's an ability to hold the complexity and contradiction inside of maybe a Christian identity, but also be able to critique and analyze Christian institutions. And that they see themselves as a sacred and spiritual person. Their coping skills increase around sort of the narrative that they're telling in their heads about themselves and other people. They're present, right? So they're not dissociating. They might engage in some ongoing practice, like a meditation, praying, running, to really be in a constant connection with their spiritual self. And physically, we see people's bodies like literally changing, and they might be standing taller. There might be some softening in parts of their bodies where they might have held a lot of contractions because of trauma held there. And they're able to feel their bodies and feel more sensations. They're more aware of their body. They have new practices that allow for them to trust more, to be more vulnerable. And they're responding to situations rather than reacting. So they feel good about how they're responding to the world. And then emotionally, like they can feel feelings instead of cutting the feelings off a few seconds in. They can actually let a whole feeling happen. And they're able to self-regulate and not really lean on other crutches that they might have used in the past. And then they're also able to integrate new experiences, make meaning of that, and let those go as well. And so really, these are the ways that we've seen people really come in for services, engage with the community, find healing, and then also turn around and give that to their community members as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I have some links and stuff to a lot of my resources if you have other questions or anything. I realize that we're just at time, my apologies, but if maybe there's one or two questions, I'm happy to answer them. Also, I'm happy to answer questions at my email if people need to head out and are not able to answer or ask any questions now.
Nazma? Oh, excuse me, Nazma. I will do one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I will
Sure.
give you one question from Lolita Yazzie. Can you hear me, Nazma?
What was that? Sorry.
I might be. Can I type in a question for you and then?
Can I type in a question for you?
Oh, yes. Oh. Okay, so one question is to go over which terms are used by natives and non-natives in reference to coming out and coming in. So in general, we see that the mainstream community, which is primarily non-native, it can also be native people because we are, participating in that. But the terms that the mainstream community uses is coming out. And when we look to scholars like Alex Wilson, talk with community members and their practices within their families or their tribes, communities, we see terms like coming in, welcoming back in, becoming, those sorts of things, or even whatever their specific terms are for themselves or their communities. We see a very different use and term of the word, and it's all specific to communities, as well as a very different lived experience about how to be within your communities.
Awesome. Were there any other questions? If you have a question, you can type it in on the box. Otherwise, I am just going to say thank you so much to NASBA. This has been a fantastic presentation. As you can see, the handouts are in the files in the bottom left-hand corner, and if you don't see them, I know we send that out shortly after the webinar, and NASBA's recording will be posted on our YouTube site. Thank you so much again to NASBA, and thank you to everyone for all of your patience with us as we're learning to run the webinar series while Kate's on maternity leave. And as I close out this meeting, you'll go ahead and be directed to a giver form, and that form will just give you a chance to give us some feedback on the webinar and how we can improve our webinars. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone.